Okay, we're live.
Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to Nottinghamshire and City of Nottingham Fire and Rescue Authority Finance and Resources Subcommittee on Friday the 15th of January to commence at 10 o'clock. We're just after that time, a few technical glitches with getting the meeting streaming live, but we are now here and hopefully people can catch up on this recording if they need to. We've got a number of items on the agenda today, so I'm going to start with the first formal agenda item, which is apologies for absence, and just note Councillor John Clark, who ordinarily chairs this committee, is away for a medical appointment today, and therefore I'm substituting for him and will be chairing today's meeting. I'm Councillor Michael Payne, Chair of the Fire Authority. Other members present here today are Councillor Toby Neal, the Vice Chair of the Fire Authority, Councillor Andrew Brown, who is the lead spokesperson for the opposition group, Councillor Mike Quigley, MBE, and Councillor Nick Rain with us here as well today. I'm just going to now bring in Chief Fire Officer John Buckley to announce which officers are here joining us today to support the committee as we proceed through the agenda items and reports. John.
Thank you, Chair. Officers present, myself, Chief Fire Officer, Area Manager Becca Smethers, Head of Finance and your Treasurer, Area Manager Gavin Harris, Head of ICT, Area Manager Terry Scott, who is Head of Procurement and Resources, and Ian Pritchard, who is Project Lead for our HQ disposal programme within move to joint headquarters. And then we have some guests with us today. Phil Dent, Rob Disney, both from internal audit from the County Council, and Ellen Henshaw from external auditors, Ernest and Young. Thank you, Chair.
Great, thank you very much for that, John. So we'll move on to, I don't think there are any other apologies for absence, so we'll move on to item 2, declarations of interest. And I will just declare at the outset, which I'll repeat later on in the meeting today, that when it comes to the exempt section of the agenda today, which is an issue dealing with land and the legal title of the headquarters at Bestwood Lodge, I have a non-pecuniary interest, but I will be vacating the chair and leaving the meeting and not partaking in the discussion and vote on that agenda item. That agenda item will be chaired by Councillor Toby Neal, the Vice Chair. I myself am both a Gedling Borough Councillor and County Councillor for the locality, and therefore feel it appropriate to recuse myself from the discussion and decision on that item. Are there any other declarations of interest that people want to declare at this point? No? Okay, we'll move on to agenda item 3, which is the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of January 2020. I obviously wasn't present at the meeting, so I will be guided by colleagues in the room who were here. Any comments and questions that people want to raise in relation to the minutes? Not seeing any indication. Are people happy that they are correct record? Does somebody want to move them who was here, propose them who was here at present at the meeting?
Yeah.
Toby?
Yeah.
Toby, Councillor Toby.
I'll move the minutes and approve the minutes.
Nick, are you happy to second them? I saw you indicate.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, colleagues happy to approve them as a correct record of the meeting? Show of hands if you can, please. Toby, you happy? Okay, that's unanimous. Those minutes are approved. So we now move on to the first substantive agenda item, which is item 4, the Revenue, Capital and Prudential Code Monitoring Report up to the 30th of November 2020, which is a report of the Chief Fire Officer. I think this is going to be introduced by our Treasurer and Head of Finance, Becky Smethers. Becky, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Chair. So, this is the monitoring position, the latest monitoring position for this year's financial expenditure. You received the report back in November, and this is the change from then is very small, really. The current underspend projection is just under 1.4 million. And that's a drop from about 100,000 from the November report, and that's through additional planned expenditure. If you remember, we're trying to invest in some other areas to try and prevent expenditure in future years, for example. So that's planned. We did expect that to decrease a little bit. So in table 1, on page 12, you'll see the breakdown of that underspend. About 750,000 is going to be a change to general reserve. So we would, if this position remains at the end of the financial year, we'll be putting 748,000 back into general reserves, which will put us in a strong position going forward with future year funding uncertainty that you'll be aware of and that we'll be discussing in the next report. We've got several grants that we've received during the year. So they total about 376,000 that we don't anticipate spending this year because the grants have been received partway through the year and they've been used to fund things like salaries for perhaps a 1-year fixed contract to help us deliver some of these services relating to Grenfell and the COVID expenditure as well. We've got several contracts there that run into next year, so the funding for those needs to roll forward as well, and that's when you see the variance in that final column in the table. Earmark reserves, you'll remember that we made the decision to use some of the current year underspend to protect the transformation and collaboration reserve, which is set aside to help us deliver the future strategic objectives of the service. So rather than use the funding from that reserve, we've decided to maintain that, and so we can use it in future years, and then we can fund it out of this year's underspend. So I wasn't going to spend a lot of time going through the detail on the expenditure variances because, as I said earlier, they're very similar to those that were reported back in November. So moving on to reserves on page 15 and 2.21, these just is updating of the reserve levels to reflect those underspends that we've just been discussing. So it leaves us with a projected balance for at the end of March of £10.6 million. And as I said earlier, that does put us in a strong position moving forward with future year funding uncertainty. So moving on to the capital programme, and 2.27, and we've got a 5.8 million expenditure programme for the year. The spend to date is just short of 2 million, but we're hoping that should increase. A lot of the expenditure on that is relating to the headquarters, which, as you're aware, is moving ahead on target. I think there's a small amount of slippage on that, but other than that, it's progressing very well. So we've got a few additional items in the capital programme that we're requesting approval for as part of the report. We're investing 57,000, or we want to invest 57,000 of the COVID-19 grant that we've received from the government to improve the conferencing facilities at headquarters, so that when we do get round to being able to meet in person, we've got adequate audio systems to allow social distancing. We need a slight amendment to the SharePoint software because we would like to migrate that onto the cloud, so it will save us moving it across at a future date when we move into the new headquarters. So we're asking for 24,000 for that. Again, that would have been a project that would have happened in the longer run. It's much easier to do it all at the same time. And then on 2.38, airbag replacement, we've undertook a trial. We estimated the cost, but when we've undertaken the trial, that we've had to make some modifications and provide it in a slightly different way. There's an additional cost of 14,000 for that. So those are recommendations of the report. The prudential monitoring, there's no issues in there. Everything's in line with the projected within the limits. So I'm not going to spend much time on that because there aren't any issues. So recommendations is to note the report and to approve those 3 areas of additional to the capital programme. Thank you, Chair. I'll take any questions if anybody's got any.
Thank you, Becky. And I think just before we open up the discussion on the report, put on record, I think, comment to the whole committee that thanks to you, Becky, and the finance team for steering us through a very difficult year. I know there have been different streams of funding coming in and out, and obviously different pressures as a result of the COVID pandemic, and some of that is highlighted and elucidated in the report before us. I think the 2 things that stand out for me are the underspend, the forecast outturn position of 43.967 million against the revised budget position of 45.365 million. So the underspend of 1.398 million, very clearly aligned to the two direct impacts of COVID. One in terms of Section 31 grants and the money that hasn't yet been allocated. And I think it is very clear to see for anybody watching this committee that we are now in the eye of a very difficult period in terms of this pandemic, and clearly we will need to be using some of those monies going forward for other activities, some of which you've drawn attention to in today's report, Becky. And secondly, obviously the impact of the COVID pandemic on our ability to recruit and take on additional staff in the way that we'd originally planned. So £1.022 million of that underspend, clearly again aligned to the impact in terms of vacancies in whole-time pay pending recruitment. That's really clear and important, and that's highlighted up front for us in the report. I'll throw open the item for any comments or questions that people want to raise for Becky, and then I'll move the recommendations after we've had the discussion. Councillor Nick Raine.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for that, Becky. I'd echo what Michael just said, and it's very good news about our reserves. We're in a better situation than a lot of councils. We won't go into that. The only thing that apart from what Michael's just said in terms of him is the £57,000 for a sound system. That does seem rather a lot. I know we're not here to micromanage things, but I looked at that and thought that's rather excessive. Any explanation there, John?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, it is. It is expensive because it's fully integrated into Teams as well. So as well as it being an audio system, which will give individual microphones or desk microphones in a group setting, which are then relayed back through an integrated speaker system. It can also fully integrate into Teams, and this is really, so it's more than a simple PA system. We've had conversations this week, myself and Gav Harris on the call at ICT, because Gav's actually running this, about potentially not installing it at headquarters because of the restrictions of being extended. And we're only about 14 months away now from relocating. So I know Gavin was going to speak to the supply today about potentially locating it in Highfield Station instead, which is also a conferencing facility that we've got. And it's really about, as well as providing better audio for meetings, it is about being able to provide audio for distanced meetings, because we think that's going to be a longer term sort of problem we're dealing with. So that's what it is. Gav, I know you're indicating, you can probably talk a bit more about the detail of why it's so expensive, if we want to use that phrase.
Just to give you an example of what it's going to be like, I don't know whether any of you saw some of the committees. There was a committee this week where Boris Johnson was sat on his own in a committee room with the screens in the middle, so he could talk to everybody. It's going to be a little bit more like that. So it means that you can have people in a room, people on Teams or Zoom. We're going to have mobile microphones as well. So it's going to be quite a good system. It's much better than what we've already got at HQ, which is probably creaking. And as John said, I'm arranging with the supplier at the minute for him to go and do a site survey at Highfields rather than HQ, because I'd suggested to John that maybe we'd be putting it in and perhaps never really using it. So I think that's probably the better course of action for us now. So I'm just waiting for that to get confirmed, and then the supplier will go in and do the site surveys.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Gavin. Does that answer the question, Nick?
Yes, yeah, I was just wondering, because it did seem rather expensive, but yeah, I've got more of an idea now. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions on this report? The recommendations then are that members note the contents of the report and that we approve the following amendments to the 2021 capital programme: to approve the addition of the conference room sound system project costing £57,000, which will be funded from the COVID-19 Section 31 grant, which is highlighted in Section 2.29 of the public report. Approve the increase of £24,000 for the migration of SharePoint to a cloud-based product, which again is explained in Section 2.30 of the report. To improve the increase, final recommendation of £14,000 for airbag replacement, again explained in section 2.38 of the report. I'm going to move those recommendations, and I'm going to invite Councillor Andrew Brown to formally second the recommendations.
Second,
Thank you very much, Andy. Can I have a show of hands? People happy to? In fact, actually, no. What I'm going to do is there's very few of us, so just for transparency purposes, I will just whip round the room for, against, or abstention. So from myself, Councillor Michael Payne, for. Councillor Andrew Brown.
for.
Thank you. Councillor McRae.
For.
Councillor Toby Neal.
For.
And Councillor Mike Quigley. I seem to have lost Mike. I don't know whether he lost his signal.
He's dropped off, Chair.
Dropped off. Okay. Okay. Well, that's unanimously approved. Hopefully, Councillor Mike Quigley, but maybe having some signal issues. Hopefully, we'll.
I'm just letting him in.
Okay. We'll bear with a second. I'll give Mike the opportunity to vote in this. Can you hear me all right, Mike?
Yeah, just I lost signal and it just dropped out.
It's fine, Mike. Mike, are you happy to just gone around the room? Just you left to vote for, against, or abstention on these recommendations. Mike, I've moved them and they've been seconded by Andy Brown.
No, happy to approve.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, those recommendations are unanimously approved. So we'll move on to the next agenda item today, agenda item 5, which is budget proposals for 2021-22 through to 2024-25 and options for council tax 2021-22. And I will just state for transparency purposes at this stage that it's the role of this committee to make a recommendation on council tax levels to the Fire Authority. The final decision obviously rests with the full Fire Authority, and that is obviously one part of the paper here before us. This is a report of the Chief Fire Officer, but I think this again is going to be introduced by our Head of Finance and Treasurer, Becky Smathers. So over to you, Becky.
Thank you, Chair. So this report also provides an update from the medium-term financial strategy that was reported to Fire Authority back in November. At that time, we had very little information on the funding announcements, and even we'd not finished developing all the budgets for the future year. So there's been quite significant areas of change and different areas of assumptions. So I'm going to run through all of those with you. So in the medium-term financial strategy, we were projecting that we could be up to around about 1.2 million short in the most likely case scenario. Since then, we've had the provisional local government finance settlement, which has firmed up a lot of the grant figures that we were expecting. So we did actually receive an additional grant of 550,000, which we weren't expecting at the time. So that has helped alleviate some of the pressure. We also assumed a pay freeze and a 2% increase in the government grant that we would receive, which would offset each other somewhat. If you might remember, in the Chancellor's announcement, they were anticipating or recommending a pay freeze for local government workers and public sector workers. But that is not something that they can dictate to any of our the firefighter staff or the local government workers, because they're set by independent panels, the National Joint Council. So we're still awaiting those. We won't know those probably till into the new year. But what I've assumed as part of in the figures that are before you today is a 1% pay increase, and that being just slightly above inflation. And it sets a middle way so that we've got something built in should the pay rise be awarded. And so, as I said, it's in line with inflation. It may come in slightly above or slightly less, but we can adjust the figures, and I feel happy that we've got something in there to cover that should that arise. The grant, we received a flat level of grant, not the 2% rise, so that has affected us a little bit. But as I said, I've assumed a 1% pay increase, so it's not the full 2% impact that it could have been. With the council tax base, if you remember that when we set the medium-term financial strategy, we were talking about the future economy being hit and the council tax collection fund, I had some concerns about the ability for the billing authorities to collect the council tax precepts. Now we received estimates from them, from all the billing authorities on the council tax base. So I've built those in, and they're showing a small increase of about 0.2% to the council tax base, whereas I'd assumed a decrease in the medium-term financial strategy. So that's left us in about, I think it was about just under 300,000 better off as well. The one area that I've still got the figures are still largely estimated is business rate income that's collected again on behalf of ourselves from the billing authorities. At the moment, the council are providing, not the council, the central government are providing a lot of support for businesses. They've had business rate holidays, and the collection, we get compensated for those holidays by central government. So although businesses are going through a hard time, we're receiving a lot of the funding that we would normally, almost all of the funding that we would normally receive, and the deficit on the business rate collection fund is around about 50,000, which is very small. You'll agree for the year. In the medium-term financial strategy, I'd assumed that that support would drop out from the government for next year. But having discussions with other authorities and with us now in a further lockdown, collectively most of us have, well, all of us have gone forward with that those arrangements will continue into next year. So I've assumed that business rate income will stay static into next year rather than reduce. So that's made a difference. You'll see in section 2.48 that we've identified some areas where we've managed to reduce budgets that total £600,000. So we've actively gone through our budgets and tried to identify any areas that we can reduce those budgets. And we've also put in some investments. We've reinvested some of that money into other areas. We've largely the on-call section is done really well this year with the impact of COVID. They've been a really success, and they've helped us support the service throughout, and they enabled us to continue. They've been available to deliver all the food parcels. They've been able, their training, they've managed to provide over different days, and that's been really successful. We found that we've had a higher attendance at those levels, and especially as some of those on-call officers have been furloughed from their full-time positions. We've had we've done really well there, and they've provided the support. So we're anticipating that that will have a roll-on effect into next year, and we've increased the amount that we've allowed for on-call firefighters. We're actively reviewing, trying to build on that for next year, and in fact we're about to embark on a trial run to see if we can change the way that we keep our on-call staff. So there's some investment in the on-call area into next year. ICT, you'll be aware of all the developments that we've had in this current year. So we have further investment on the ongoing impact of that the licensing fees and the software fees for those the new systems that we've put in place require an increase into next year. And also we've had increase in the maintenance of the property maintenance and the fleet maintenance following a big review. We've tried to do it in a lot more planned way than a reactive way going forward. So it should reduce, although we're investing in it in the short term, it should reduce that expenditure in the longer term. So if I move forward to the tables with the information in 2.58, shows all the information, and in 2.56 to all those bullet points are the assumptions that we've made that I've just run through. I'm just checking I haven't missed any in there. So obviously these figures do still assume those business rates, the business rate support carries on, which is quite a risk area, and the 1% pay increase. So those are the two areas where these figures may still yet change. but they show if we don't increase any council tax in 21-22, we'll be short by 576,000, and then that increases. That's assuming a nil rate of council tax increase for each of those years. So that's why it increases so significantly. And if we didn't increase those council tax, it would reduce the general fund balances to below the minimum level by the end of 2024-25. So if the pay award came in at 1% higher, it would increase that deficit, increase the deficit to in the area of 900,000, which would have quite a significant impact on reserves. So in table 2 on the next page, on page 38, this is which shows the impact if we have a council tax increase of 1.95%. It shows we'd be in a deficit position of £65,000. As I said, I've still got some uncertainties in future year, and I'll be looking to try and balance that before we come to the February fire authority. But until I've got the final figures, I don't want to start trying to identify the areas that it's a very small amount. It's less than 0.1% of the total budget. So I'm sure we can sort that out in time for fire authority. So if 2.63 shows the impact of a 1.95% increase in council tax. So a band D at the moment is 80 in this financial year is £81.36. So that would increase it to £82.95, which is an increase of £1.59 for the year. You'll see that up at band A, the increase is just over £1.06 from £54.24 to £55.30. So our council tax preset remains, I hope, to offer value for money into the future. So, the options that we've been given in the provisional settlement are that we can increase council tax up to 2% without holding a referendum. So that's where the 1.95% has been derived from. Section 2.66 table 4 shows a comparison of the two information that I've provided in the report. If council tax were not increased, we'd require £5.3 million of our reserves to balance by 24-25, which obviously is not sustainable in the longer term. So I think that's it from my point of view. The issues that I'd like to pick up with you. So if anybody's got any questions, I'm more than willing to take them.
Thank you, Becky. Thanks for comprehensively setting out the position over the medium-term financial plan up to 2024-25. I think for me there are two key things that I just wanted to pull out, which I think you've already drawn attention to, Becky, which is, first of all, the pay award, which is referenced in 2.14 of the report. And I think to make clear on behalf of the committee that the position I set out, budgeting for a 1%, but allowing that room for 2% in terms of the reserves that we have, is simply about taking a responsible position so that the authority is well placed pending the independent outcome of the NJC process, which determines pay. Obviously, we're aware the Chancellor's made an announcement, but there is an independent process which the report rightly draws attention to that will set pay for colleagues in our sector. And the position I set out in this report, which is budgeting just over inflation, which is running at 0.6%, so 1% plus space to go up to 2%, is simply about taking a responsible position. It's not about trying to pass a judgment or influence the decision of the NJC. That is obviously a separate and independent process. I think it goes without saying that all colleagues on this call recognise the outstanding work of people within Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service and across the fire sector throughout this year. They've really risen to the challenge and have been part of those COVID heroes who have protected some of the most vulnerable people in our communities and have done, I think, a sterling job. And I was talking to Councillor Andy Brown about some of the great work going on in communities yesterday, and the fire service has stepped up and played its role, and our colleagues should be commended for that. And I think that goes without saying, and has been expressed at numerous occasions publicly by fire authority members, but I just wanted to restate that today. The second point I think I'd just draw attention to in relation to council tax, we're obviously asked to make a recommendation to full fire authority. I think table 2 is quite stark. The difference if we choose to effectively freeze council tax or the other option, raise council tax by £1.24 pence a year for a band B property, £1.59 for a band D property. The contrast is stark. You know, as you said, Becky, a difference between £65,000 deficit this year or a 560 plus £500,000 deficit if we choose to freeze council tax. So we're in an invidious position. We know the impact of COVID has been great, not just on institutions like ours, but more importantly on individual families. We know that families are feeling the pinch in terms of the impacts of COVID-19. We do, however, know that a number of councils do have council tax support schemes in place to shield some of the most vulnerable. Certainly, I can speak from my own experience in Gedling. We do have a 100% council tax reduction scheme that does shield some of those at the sharp end who have been impacted by the pandemic. But I think all things being considered, and given the good value for money, I think that the fire authority and the fire service, indeed, the work that goes on in communities, I think given the financial challenges that we face, and I think we'll continue to face in light of the fact that this pandemic is not over yet and there are other pressures on the budget, my recommendation to the committee would be that we increase by the I think relatively small increase. If you look at the real terms of 1.95%, which, as I say, is £1.24 pence for a band B property or £1.59 for a band D property. I don't say that glibly. I know that there's been a big impact on families, but I think if you look at the cold hard figures, and if we want to maintain, I think the good service that the Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service provides, that would be the prudent and sensible decision to take. We'll of course continue, and this fire authority's got a proud record of working with the government, with government ministers, with local MPs to put our case across about the need for sustainable funding for the fire sector, and we will continue to do that. I think we've done that very strongly here in Nottinghamshire in a cross-party way, in a constructive way, not in a partisan way or a glib way, and we will continue to do that because we know that we continue to face pressures, and I think we are well placed here because we've got a Chief Fire Officer in John Buckley who is leading on finance in the National Fire Chiefs Council, and I know that he has vociferously made the case to the Home Office and other colleagues in central government about the need to put the fire sector on a sustainable funding footing. So my recommendation to the committee would be that we recommend to the fire authorities, we're not making the decision here today, a 1.95% increase. And as I say, I just wanted to restate the position in terms of the pay award, that it's simply about putting the authority in a responsible position for whatever the outcome of the NJC discussions when they come. Anybody else want to come in on the report? Councillor Andy Brown and then Councillor Nick Ray.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank Becky and the team, as usual, doing a splendid job over the last 12 months through some of the most unprecedented times that are going on at the moment. I think it's fair to say that over the last 4 years, when I first joined the fire authority, our reserves were very low. And following the work that's been done by John and his team and Becky, we've made some really good savings from collaboration work, procurement work, jointly with the police and other fire authorities, which puts us now in a better position than quite a lot of fire authorities and indeed some local authorities. Had we not done that work over the last few years, I don't think we'd be talking about a 1.95%. We'd be talking about going to referenda and increasing it more, because we'd certainly be a lot worse off than a lot of other people. So I agree with you what you've said, Michael. 1.95%. Yeah, we don't really. I mean, it would be great to freeze it, because they struggle. A lot of people out there are going through, but I think for the service that we're providing, and like I've said before, people treat the fire authority or fire service a little bit different to other emergency services. So yeah, I'll be voting for it, and so will my group as well.
Are you happy to formally second that
I'm happy to
recommendation?
formally second it, Michael, as well, yes.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Councillor Rain?
Yeah, I'd like to, I'm glad that Councillor Brown said that. I think, people know my views. I don't agree with council tax away to fund services. I think it's regressive. And I do think if the public are watching this, and it should be mentioned at Fire Authority, that, we realise people are struggling to pay their bills at the moment. People are in reduced circumstances. A lot of people I represent, we're talking about, they're just about managing, who do the right thing, go out to work and struggle. And obviously, any increase is going to hit them. I know it's only a small amount. I agree that we have to do it, looking at the finances, but I really think it should be funded elsewhere. The government should be giving people money because, like Councillor Brown, I think it should be frozen, recognising that some people have really struggled, particularly with COVID-19. That aside, the only thing that concerns me about this, and I'm sure it keeps a lot of us awake at night on councils, is the issue of business rates at 2.27, as Becky was saying, because we don't know. I don't think anyone's got a crystal ball about what's going to happen, particularly to the hospitality sector. I'm thinking of, Nottingham, and particularly, office space in other areas, and how things are going to change. So that's always going to be, I think, difficult. It's good to hear the government is supporting us, possibly a lot more than some local authorities. But I've just got some concerns that is potentially an area where we could go badly wrong. And I know Becky's explained that well, I felt, but it's just an area of concern for me because I don't think anyone can predict what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years.
Thanks, Nick. Becky?
Yeah, I'd just come back and say that we do collect about £3.7 million from business rates from local businesses. So it does have the potential, and that's one of the uncertainties going forward. Because obviously, if we do get some support this next year from central government, that may well not carry on into future years. So it is a big area of risk, but a 10% drop would be about £370,000 for this authority.
Thank you, Becky. Any other comments or questions? If there aren't, I'm going to formally move the recommendation, which has been seconded by Councillor Andrew Brown, that we recommend to full Fire Authority an increase of 1.95% council tax for the year ahead. Okay, Councillor Michael Payne, Chair, for. Councillor Andrew Brown, for, against, or abstention. Thank you. Councillor Nick Rain.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Toby Neal.
For.
Thank you very much. Councillor Mike Quigley.
For.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, so that recommendation is approved unanimously. We're now going to move on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 6, the internal audit annual report for 2019-2020 report of the Chief Fire Officer. Becky, are you introducing this report again?
Yeah, if I could just quickly introduce it. This is a delayed report. Normally we would bring this much earlier in the year. In fact, last year we took 2 reports so that this being the audit committee could give due scrutiny to all the audit reports rather than receiving the whole years in one go. We haven't been able to do that this year as this committee hasn't met. It wasn't a decision making and there were no major areas of concern. So this is the first time this has been brought before members, although the chair of this committee does receive all the audit reports when they're published. So I'd like to hand over to, I think it's Rob Disney, who's going to be presenting the report on behalf of the internal auditors. Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, everybody.
Rob, we're just bring your microphone down slightly, Rob. We're not quite catching the sound.
Is that better?
Just a bit more if you can.
Is that better now?
Better, Rob. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just by way of introduction of myself, and I'm the head of internal audit at Nottinghamshire County Council, and that's the same role I provide for the Fire and Rescue Service head of internal audit. I'm joined today by my colleague Phil Dent. Phil, do you want to just quickly say hello and briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm the audit supervisor at Nottinghamshire County Council. This is a newly created post as a result of a restructure of the internal audit team about 12 months ago. So I'm essentially a deputy team manager, the team manager being Simon Lacey, who isn't here today, but I play an active role in collaboration with the fire service in setting the plan, supervising audits and reporting progress, and I'll also be preparing some of the annual reports going forward.
Thanks, Phil. So as Becky mentioned, it is a much delayed report this time around. So it's obviously that's due to the obvious. And so it's not timely assurance that we're presenting this time. It's a bit more of a retrospective on the 1920 year. But obviously circumstances have dictated that that's the way it is this time around. Nonetheless, the aim of the report is to bring together assurance that's available around three aspects: governance, risk management and control. And all of that feeds into my Head of Internal Audit annual opinion for 2019-20. Now, in doing that, I look to see what evidence and suitable assurance I can draw on. Obviously, a key plank of that is the direct work that the internal audit team does through delivering the annual plan. And that's set out in part B of the report. And as Becky's mentioned, the detailed reports as well from that work are attached in with the papers. But there are other sources of assurance available to me as well. We've been looking at the assurance framework around those three elements: governance, risk management and control. And that's set out in Appendix B. That's a development for this year. And it brings in the concept of the three lines of defence as well. So I just want to just say a word about that, just to make sure that people feel clear on what that is. The first line of defence essentially is your frontline managers who are applying day-to-day controls around governance and risk management and effective delivery of all of the activities that their teams are doing day to day. Second line is typically corporate functions. So that's people like Becky's team in finance, HR, health and safety, those sorts of functions. And then the third line are people like ourselves, internal audit, plus other internal inspections. And it did strike me actually looking at your agenda today that that's quite well highlighted really in the running order for your all the papers on today, because the first two substantive items on the agenda today have essentially come to you from Becky on the second line, and then all the next three reports on your agenda are essentially coming from the third line in ourselves, external audit and Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary and Fire Services. That probably highlights it as well as anything, to be honest. So what we've done around that assurance framework is to establish some key lines of inquiry and to gather what evidence was available from those, and we've presented that through to you as part of this report. So I think that's an improvement really in terms of our annual opinion for 1920. It's an important part of the report, I feel. Hopefully it's a useful one for yourselves too on the committee in bringing together that combined view of the different sources of assurance that are available to you. And the result of all of that is that I'm able to bring forward positive assurance and a positive opinion on the government's governance, risk management and control framework for 1920. The report also then sets out 2020-21 audit plan. Again, we're late in bringing that through to you. Clearly, it's been a disrupted year in delivering that plan, but it is one that we're making good progress on it currently, and we're in January now, so it's not going to be too far away before we're coming back to the committee to report on the outcome of that work. Potentially in HQ, but who knows on that front. So that's as much as I wanted to say by way of introduction, and we'll happily pick up any feedback or questions that members might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and you're most welcome to the committee today, and you as well, Phil, and I just want to put on record my thanks on behalf of the authority for the fantastic and important work that you do. I know sometimes people see the issue of audit as being quite a dry subject, but it certainly isn't. And I think it's a very important subject. And actually, this pandemic, I think, has highlighted the importance of, transparency, of good governance, of good decision making, and making sure that the people at the end of the day who are here to serve, who actually pay for the service as well, the residents in our communities, can be assured that the organisation is being run in an efficient, effective, transparent and proper way. Comprehensive report, Rob and Phil and colleagues, gives us assurance and hopefully gives the public assurance as well. So thank you for your work. We're asked to note the report, but Rob has invited the committee. If they've got any comments or questions on the report, then I'll hand over to colleagues. Councillor Andrew Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question for Rob. And Rob, thanks for that report. First, just quick, I'll ask both questions together. First of all, what is a Cardiff, Cardiff, I think it's the Cardiff report?
Cardiff check, the Cardiff checks.
Cardiff checks, that's it. And secondly, on page appendix 2, there's an area that goes on to speak about fuel security, consumption of fuel recording, inadequate system controls to prevent misappropriation of fuel, inadequate procedures to accurately monitor the consumption of fuel, and one or two others. I just wondered what's been done to sort that one out. And the Cardiff checks question, please, Chair.
Rob, do you want to answer those, and then I'll see if anybody else wants to come in?
Certainly, yeah. I'll actually try and split that. So while I answer the Cardiff check one, if I could ask my colleague Phil to have a look at the second one on the report. So Cardiff checks it's actually a process that the fire service, the fire committee, has been engaged with for quite some time. If I'm honest, it's quite an old and slightly outdated approach really to audit, but nonetheless it does have its hope, and it does have can bring its benefits. So essentially what it does, it's called Cardiff checks because I think it was originated in Cardiff Council who brought it in, but it takes you would take a sample invoice, and you would follow that invoice from its cradle to grave is the term that's used. So you would go right back to the beginning. How did we end up paying for this particular service that's been paid for on a particular invoice? And the idea was you would go through each element of control that payment has gone through. So it will go through how did we specify that we wanted that good or service? How did we go about determining where we were going to purchase it from? How was that approved? All the way through to the release and authorization of the payment at the end. The idea being that that will then cast or shine some light on the effectiveness of the controls that you have in place. The reason I say it's outdated a little bit in these times is because of all of the opportunities that we have to use technology really to bring a different approach. And it's something that I think we've spoken over the last couple of years in trying to adapt that pure approach to Cardiff checks, where you would literally just pick one invoice out of a batch sample. And we've tried to bring the opportunities that we have around data analytics really to have a look at, well, where might we do some analysis of all the payments that the authority has made, and can we use that to give us an indication of where it might be worth looking in one particular area more than another? Because if for example, a good indication of that is around the authorization process. So rather than just pick out one invoice and check, well, how has that been authorized? We should now have the capability to look at all of the transactions in the fire services system and do an analysis of that, and have they all been authorized in the way that you would expect. So you're getting much bigger assurance on 100% sample in that case. So it's something that I've spoken to Becky about in the past, and I know from the process that we followed this time that we have tried to bring, or started to bring, that sort of data analytic approach into the play much more, so that the actual cradle to grave end of it that we do pick up is a bit more targeted.
Thanks for that.
If that answers that question suitably, then we'll hand over to Phil on the second part of it.
Yes, the second part was concerning an internal audit report on fuel recharges to Nottinghamshire Police. This is a good example, actually, of internal audit responding to a new and emerging area of activity and indeed risk. This is the issuing and recharging of fuel from fire fuel depots to Nottinghamshire Police vehicles. So we were asked to review this. The question asked about the potential risk areas, which are set out in table 3.1. What this might be a question of the way that the report is worded, but those are the areas of potential and not of actual risk. And the reason I say that is that paragraph 4.1 points out that the controls in place were effective to mitigate all of those risks. So none of those risk areas that are identified were actually experienced. So in other words, there is good levels of fuel security. There are good processes for recording the consumption of fuel by police vehicles. Obviously, that's a prerequisite because that forms the basis for recharging the fire from fire to police for the use of that fuel. All fuel invoices were raised and were paid. That was confirmed by audit testing. We also looked at the potential risk to fuel stocks. Obviously, if there's excessive drawing of fuel, then fuel stocks could run low, both for fire and police vehicles. But we confirmed that that is closely monitored, and that if any fuel stocks at any depot were to run low, there are fuel cards in place that can be used in an emergency. So paragraph 4.4 of the report pointed out that no recommendations needed to be made, and there were no further actions to be taken. So there's no action plan in the report at all. So actually, from looking at a new and emerging potential risk area, we were able to confirm that no risks were arising. All risks were mitigated by robust controls. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob and Phil, very, very helpful. Any other comments or questions for Rob and Phil in terms of this report? I'm not seeing any other indications, so we're asked to members to note the contents of this report. Colleagues happy to note the contents of the internal audit report? Yeah, seeing show of hands. Okay, that's unanimously agreed to note the contents of the report. We'll now move on to agenda item 7 on the report. Rob and Phil, you are happy to stay with us if you want, but feel free to leave. I know you're probably very busy. Chaps, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for coming to the committee today to report to us.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to shoot off, but Phil's going to stay.
I'm going to stay.
So thank you.
Yep, I'm interested to stay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob. Okay, agenda item 7 is the external audit plan 2019-2020. Again, we're asked to note the contents of the report. Becky, are you going to say something by way of introduction to this before introducing our colleague Helen from Ernst Young?
Yes, I can. John, I think, raised his hand. Did you have something to say? No? Okay. Right. So this again is a delayed report, unfortunately, because this committee has not met. This would normally come to members to approve the plan, so you know the risk areas that the external auditors are looking at and their approach to the audit. So it is here a bit delayed, obviously, and the audit has commenced. It's progressing well now. We're hoping to bring the final audit report to February Fire Authority. I don't think there are any major issues that have come out of it yet, unless Helen's going to tell me something different. But yeah, so I'd like to hand over to Helen just to introduce this report. Thanks, Helen.
Okay, Helen.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks, Chair. So following along in the pack, we're on page 88 of the pack. And as Becky mentioned, this report is somewhat aged now. It was prepared in March 2020. I believe it was circulated at around that time, but this is the first opportunity we've actually had to present the report. Where there are updates, as you would expect, as a result of COVID, etc., I'll try and just build those into my explanations as we go along. As Becky mentioned, the audit is in its latter stages of completion at the moment, so our report to the committee, which wraps up the audit results report, will contain those updates in writing, but I'll try and mention as many of them as I can as I'm talking through just now. I'm going to take the report as read, so it's quite a lengthy report. I'm not going to go through each page by page. I'm just going to take us to the more salient points. So first, I'm going to direct us to page 92 of your packs, which is page 5 of our report. And that page sets out the risks that we've identified with respect to the financial statements audit. Now, the committee will be aware that the external auditor is required to provide an opinion on the truth and fairness of the financial statements, and also to provide a conclusion in respect of value for money. So page 92 is focused on that first element of the financial statement audit. Now, the first two risks that are identified on the table there, the first one, misstatements due to fraud and error, that's identified as a fraud risk. There's no change from the prior year. That is not a risk which is specific to Nottinghamshire Fire Authority. That's a risk which auditing standards require us to identify on every audit. And in simple terms, that's the risk that management who are in a position of power over the internal control environment could use that position of power inappropriately to manipulate the financial records fraudulently. And we perform specific procedures targeted at looking at that risk effectively. The second risk in the table is the risk of fraud in revenue and expenditure recognition. Now, what that effectively is talking to is whether or not the revenue received by the organisation and the expenditure that incurred has been recognised appropriately and in the correct financial year. So, for example, in the current year, if you'd incurred expenditure but that had not been put through the account, so it had been sort of held back and was not going to be reflected until a future year, that would give an inappropriate view in the current year of the outturn of the organisation. So that's the sort of risk we're looking at there. Auditing standards, again, require us to consider that on every audit, not just the audit of Nottinghamshire Fire. But what we have done is tailored that risk, and why we've labelled it as new is we've tailored that this year and said we believe that the most likely place of that sort of thing occurring at Notts Fire would be expenditure which is inappropriately capitalised into fixed assets. So expenditure which is taken out of the outturn for the year and popped on the balance sheet effectively. The next risk identified in the table is the risk around the valuation of the pension liability for the firefighters' pension scheme. We have elevated that in the current year to a significant risk area. And the reason for that is the sheer size of the liability with respect to the firefighters' pension scheme and the impact that judgments which were had around legal cases in 1819, but which are continuing to have implications for the funding of that scheme going forward, have on the numbers in the financial statements. It's subject to a high degree of estimation uncertainty, and therefore we've elevated that risk to significant risk in our audit plan. The valuation of land and buildings is also an area which we've elevated this year to significant risk, and that's primarily due to the extent and number of misstatements which were identified around the valuation of land and buildings in the audit for the previous year. So taking that, cumulative knowledge of the experience we had for the prior audit, we've taken that through to this year and elevated the risk around the valuation of land and buildings. The other risk identified on that page is regarding the valuation of the local government pension scheme. That's the other pension scheme which appears in the authority's balance sheet, and we've had no change in the risk designation for that particular risk area this year. Now, if I could take you on to page 94, we set out the materiality level that we work to. So just as a recap, materiality is the concept which said how much would the accounts need to be wrong by in order to change a decision that a user would make based on these financial statements. And at that top level, we've set materiality at the planning stage of the audit at £1.34 million, which is 2% of last year's gross expenditure. That's in line with the typical sort of range that you would use as a fire authority. Obviously, our testing needs to be more detailed than just looking at things over £1.3 million. So auditing standards require us to set what's termed a performance materiality. So that's the materiality level that we consider when we're looking at individual accounts within the financial statements. That can fall within a range of either 50% of planning materiality or 75% of planning materiality, and that's based on the expectation of error within the accounts. Again, because of the volume of adjustments that were put through last year's financial statements, we've set performance materiality at 50%, which means the work that we perform this year will be more detailed at the account level in order to ensure that we have appropriate assurance that we have not left errors undetected in the financial statements. Then a further derivative is our audit differences threshold. That's the threshold below which we would consider a difference in the accounts to be clearly trivial. So that's the level that we will report anything found over £67,000 to yourselves as a committee in terms of output of audit procedures. Now, at the bottom of this page, page 94, there's a short paragraph on audit timetable. Now, in light of COVID-19, which descended upon us roughly the same time that this report was due to be circulated to the committee, the government has subsequently taken a view on the audit timetable for the 1920 accounts and amended it. So the audit we're targeting at the end of November for completion for 1920 financial statements. Now, clearly that date has passed. For those of you who are familiar with the financial media, you will have seen various information being put out by public sector audit appointment and others that there was less than 50% of local authorities that had their audit opinion signed by the end of November, the 1920 opinion signed by November 2020. And the reasons for that are many and varied, and we continue to work through that backlog as a profession, and obviously Notts Fire are included within that scenario. If I could now scoot us through the next section of the report, which is essentially the written area of what I've just talked you through on the financial statement risks. And if we move on to pages 103, 104, 105, this area of the report talks about the other element of the external auditor's work for the year, which is the value for money arrangements. Page 104 sets out what value for money means in the context of external audit and the arrangements which we're required under the guidance issued by the National Audit Office to consider. And they are effectively your arrangements for taking informed decisions, deploying resources in a sustainable manner, and working with partners and other third parties. The requirement of the external auditor is to identify where there are significant risks in those arrangements, and where there are significant risks, we are to perform procedures in order to form a conclusion. So at the planning stage of our audit, we identified 3 potential areas of significant risk to our value for money conclusion, which are set out on pages 105 and 106. The first one, securing financial resilience, really talks to the first item that you had on the agenda, which Becky took you through this morning, which is the situation for the authority in terms of its medium-term financial plan over the next few years. And obviously that's a moving topic, and Becky just articulated the improvements to reserves that have been achieved since this report indeed was written. But you probably won't be surprised to see that, you know, securing financial resilience is a risk to value for money, because, you know, Nottinghamshire Fire are certainly not alone in terms of the financial challenges that it faces over the coming years, and that's before the impact of COVID-19. The second risk that we identified was regarding the establishment of the joint HQ with Notts Police, and you'll note that this is somewhat out of date now because it references the setup of a limited liability partnership, which I know now has been amended in terms of a decision-making, a decision in terms of how that property will be established from a legal point of view. But the arrangements in terms of the governance of how the decision-making is happening for the establishment of that property, and the financial and operational implications for the fire authority really talk to that element of the value for money considerations that we need to think about in terms of the decision-making arrangements and the working with third parties, etc. And then the third and final value for money risk identified is articulated on page 106, And one of the requirements of the auditor when looking at value for money planning is to consider the output of other regulatory bodies and organisations. So we have to consider, in this instance, the Magistrates Inspectorate inspection findings that were published in June 2019, so within the 1920 financial year, and I'm sure the committee members will be aware of the outcome of those findings and the amount of resource which the authority is allocating to address those issues. So that will be an area which we follow up as part of our value for money arrangements to ensure that effectively the authority is taking that inspection finding appropriately and enhancing its procedures in appropriate response to the findings raised. I was then planning to take us to page 115 in your pack. Sorry for me keep referring to the right. I've written the page numbers down in case my computer is a bit slow in scrolling, which it is. So page 115 of the pack outlines the timetable for communication and deliverables, which, as I mentioned previously, is now obviously somewhat out of date. So just to give you an update on that, as Becky mentioned, the intention currently is to work to the February date for finalisation of the accounts. However, work is still ongoing, and that is dependent upon all of the audit procedures being completed in time with the support of the finance team and our ability to get through them in time. So that's the situation in terms of timetable at present. And then on page 121, there is an outline there of the fees payable for external audit. And I just want to highlight this to the committee's attention. There is, I'm sure you will have seen again in the financial press, there is a lot of discussion around external audit fees at present in both the public and private sector markets, but certainly the public sector market. And Sir Tony Redman was spent most of his year last year effectively preparing a report on the state of the public sector audit market, and published that in the latter part of last year with comments around the fee levels for financial statements audits. Myself and Becky have been in communication around the fees for quite some months now, and effectively the arrangement that Nottinghamshire Fire Authority has, just for absolute clarity, is that you are brought into public sector appointments, commissioning, if you like, of external audit services, and that means that effectively public sector audit appointments sets your fees and has complete control over the fee which Nottinghamshire Fire Authority pay for their external audit provision. That there are discussions which take place between PSAA and the authority, PSAA and the external audit firms, and the process is effectively for PSAA to approve any fee that the authority pays, so everything will be subject to their arbitration. At that point, Chair, I was going to stop and invite questions if anybody had any.
Thank you, Helen, for a thorough presentation on the report before us and talking us through some of the detail, the recommendations, and members note the contents of the report. I'll throw the item open for comment or question for Helen. Any comments or questions from members? Councillor Rain?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ellen. It was quite detailed. I mean, I don't know how far we can get with this, but the only thing that occurred to me, obviously, and the concern for us is on page 92 in terms of the risks that you're highlighting. The pension liabilities, I think we understand. The valuation of land and buildings. I mean, how concerned should we be about that?
From a perspective of the financial statement, so I think there's two things to discuss when you talk about the valuation of land and buildings. There's the valuation of them. You know, do you want to sell any of them? Are they worth, you know, money to the authority? that in some respects is a different consideration to, are they valued appropriately in the financial statements in accordance with the rules that dictate how they should be valued in the financial statements? And that's more of where this risk lies. So the valuation of a fire station, for example, it can be quite complex due to the specialized nature of the asset we're talking about, etc. So really it's an accounting issue. Has the valuation been appropriately booked into the accounts? One of the nuances of local authority accounting is actually, in terms of the outturn for the authority, the valuation of the land and buildings is somewhat irrelevant. The unfortunate thing is the rules and regulations which Becky and her team need to adhere to prepare your financial statements, and therefore for me to pass an opinion that that's been done appropriately, are quite complex and require a lot of estimation and assumptions to be made. They require the use of specialists in order to get those valuations, and then those valuations need to be posted appropriately through the financial statements. It's an area where errors can and do occur.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments or questions? The only thing I'd say, Helen, in closing, I welcome what you've said about issues around transparency, but I will just put on the public record that we did write to Ernst & Young, myself, the Vice Chair of the Authority and the lead opposition spokesperson, particular concerns around delay, which I think you've drawn attention to, Helen. I think everybody knows that COVID has had an undue impact on institutions, not least your own and certainly our own, Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service. But I think it is also fair to say in the public domain that it's been widely reported that there have been staff shortages at Ernst & Young. And I think from one of the largest professional service networks in the world that prides itself on identifying risk, the fact that it didn't prepare itself for a risk like a pandemic and didn't foresee some of these issues, I find disappointing. And whilst I hear what you say about us being linked into the public sector audit appointments process in relation to the cost of the audit, as I say, myself, the Vice Chair and the Chair did write to Ernst & Young on the 6th of January for confirmation from Ernst & Young that the audit will be completed to enable the audited accounts to be approved at the Fire Authority on the 26th of February 2021, and that costs will be contained within the original contract price. We have now obviously seen a response which came in on the date of the 8th of January, I think in your own name, Helen, that doesn't give any assurance about sticking to that price. I find that disappointing, not just on behalf of the authority, but on behalf of the good taxpayers of Nottingham and Nottinghamshire, who at the end of the day pay for this service. And yes, whilst I recognise there have been impacts in terms of COVID, as I said, Ernst & Young is one of the largest professional service networks in the world. And I think the response that we received is less than adequate in the circumstances. And I don't think it does any good for Ernst & Young's reputation that they haven't recognised the impact that a delay in the audited accounts being approved by full authority has. Put simply, it undermines public trust and confidence in institutions if they're not able to close off and finish the accounts in a timely fashion. And I know that's not only my view, but a view that's shared very strongly, not only by this committee, but by the authority. So in the interest of transparency, I think it's important to put that on the public record. I will now move the recommendation, which is that we note the contents of the report, and I'll ask Councillor Andrew Brown to formally second that recommendation.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Formally seconded, and just like quickly say that I echo your thoughts on your comments to Helen regarding the audited accounts.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask for, does everybody approve of noting the contents on the report? Show of hands. Okay, unanimous agreement. Thank you, Helen, for presenting today. Sorry that you're the recipient of feedback, but it is felt very strongly by the authority, and I know you're only the messenger on behalf of Ernst & Young. You don't set the risks and the staffing for the organisation, but at the end of the day, you are our point of contact. So if you could voice our frustrations and concerns back to your colleagues at a senior level in the organisation, we very much appreciate it. But we certainly thank you for the way in which you presented the report today and the way in which the work's been carried out with Becky by your colleagues who have carried out the process. We know that they've been constructive and collaborative and had a positive working relationship, and Becky certainly has reported that back to us as an authority and committee. Okay, we will now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is agenda item 8, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services update, and this is a report of the Chief Fire Officer, John Buckley.
Thank you, Chair. As members are aware, we were inspected back in 2019, with the outcome 2019 with areas for improvement, and the authority determined that the committee structure would apply scrutiny to all of those areas for improvement, and so they were divided up into relative committees. This report just brings to you an update on the only outstanding area for improvement, which is under the purview of this committee. And I'm pleased to say, just a headline figure of the 25 areas that we started with, we're down to literally a handful now that we are finally progressing through. So just moving to this report in full, I'm just going to draw your attention to area 2.4. This area for improvement was to address 4 specific areas to make our ICT interface for staff better. In effect, that's what it is. And you'll know, members who've been on the authority a while, that Gavin has steered us through a lot of work improving the infrastructure and the security of the system and updating it into a kind of platform which has enabled us, in actual fact, to cope with the pandemic. The resilience has been fantastic, and that is where the focus has previously been, and the focus has now shifted to improving that end user kind of experience. So mobile working, which, you know, I'm sat at home fully conducting business as we have been doing right from March, and even with the more recent COVID inspection from HMI, they've commended us for our ability to literally within a couple of days we moved our whole business to online working, and we've even had members of staff the other side of the world actually sanctioning payroll. So, you know, we've really been able to demonstrate that. So mobile working, we've completely kind of achieved. Still work to be done on that, but it is absolutely outstanding. We're ahead of the game. I'll come back to training, competency recalling. Data management has also been achieved, and it's the collection of it and cleansing presentation of that, and we're improving significantly in our performance management use of data, and user training as well has also been completed. The only area where we are still struggling is the training and competency recording. So currently we have 3 systems in use in the service, and what we wanted to do was bring that together to one system which would do all of it. Now, unfortunately, in the market, that system doesn't exist, and if we wanted something like that, it would have to be bespoke and would be extremely expensive and quite restrictive in its any future changes. So we're having another fresh look at that project, and that's going to move into 21-22 year for us to do that. But we are at least looking to be able to rationalise 3 down to 2 products being used. But again, that's going to take quite a lot of consultation with our staff, and that is still an area yet to be done. But in the round, we've probably achieved about 80-90% of this area for improvement, which is, you know, the big message here. There's just that one small part we're yet to deal with. Gavin, as it's ICT, I don't know if you wanted to add any more kind of context into that.
I think on that final point, it is something we probably need to do a bit more of a look at. Potentially, we might be able to use existing systems like our HR solution, Midland HR, iTrent. We might be able to do some work with that supplier. We do an awful lot of work with those guys. They provide the payroll system as well as the HR system. So there's a potential there maybe that we could find a solution. And it's probably worth noting as well about the training. We've got a dedicated trainer now for the first time during my tenure. In fact, I think it might be the first time ever for IT. So, and that guy's doing a really good job for us, pulling together a portfolio of training for staff. And he uses some of the new mobile applications that we've got, like Yammer and Teams and things like that, to try and push the message forward. I think holistically, it's probably worth mentioning some of the stuff we talked about in some of the other reports about joint headquarters moving, and there's the cloud work that we're doing. that is going to support further this remote working that we're going to be doing probably as the new normal, where we will get to, hopefully within the next 3 years at the latest, is a point where we don't actually need a site in terms of where people log into. We just log straight into the cloud. So that's really where we're going in terms of IT strategy. That's it. Thanks, Chair.
Yep, and if I could just add one final comment, Chair. We've been notified that we'll be receiving our COVID at 10 report. We're hoping next week. As soon as I get that, I'll circulate that to all members. And of course, I'll bring a full report on that to authority in February. I think I've indicated previously the indication at the end of the COVID inspection was very positive for the authority. So I'm hoping that's reflected in the final report.
Thank you very much, John. So I'll open it up for any comments or questions in terms of this report. We are asked to note the progress made against the area for improvement action plan. So any comments or questions for John in relation to this report? Toby?
No, I just want to say how impressed I have been with progress across this entire area, and thanks to everybody for keeping us well informed about it. I understand some of the challenges that you've had with it, and I'm particularly impressed with the areas about the almost smooth transition that I know you've had in terms of working online, and I think that's been maybe that's the one good thing you can say you got from COVID. It's tested out systems that actually everybody was keen on, but wasn't sure about, and now we know it works. So I just wanted to say thank you. It's been really good work, and thanks for keeping us well informed about progress against the report.
Thank you.
Thanks, Toby, and the rest of the committee I know would want to associate themselves with those comments as well. Councillor Andy Brown.
No, I'd just like to continue from what Councillor Neil said. Yeah, a year ago we were, disappointed with the report that we got and the fantastic work that's been done by John and his team. Just to thank you again. It's marvellous considering the lockdown, how much work's been done. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll move the recommendation, which is seconded by Councillor Andrew Brown, to note the progress against the area for improvement action plan. Show of hands for all those in favour. Okay, that's unanimously approved. The next item on the agenda is in terms of the exclusion of the public, to deal with the exempt item in relation to exempt minutes from the previous meeting held on the 17th of January, and also the substantive exempt item, which is land and legal title of the headquarters at Bestwood Lodge. I'll deal with the necessary legislation to move us into closed session, and then as I declared earlier, I do have a non-pecuniary interest in this as a borough councillor in Gedling and county councillor for the area concerned, where the headquarters is, and therefore will be leaving the meeting to allow Councillor Toby Neal to chair items 10 and 11, the exempt minutes and the substantive item itself. So the exclusion of the public, we're to consider excluding the public from the meeting during the consideration of the remaining items, which I've just referenced, in accordance with section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972 under Schedule 12A Part 1, on the basis that, having regard to all the circumstances, the public interest in maintaining an exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. So I'll move that. Is that supported by everybody? Show of hands. Okay, so we're now moving to closed session.